July 1890, Chillicothe, Ohio. A pickaxe struck something hard 6 feet down in an old Indian mound, and 4 local farmers found themselves staring at a discovery that would ignite one of the strangest legends in American history. They had been hired by the county to dig a drainage ditch across a low rise in a cornfield that locals had always known as part of the ancient Hopewell Mounds. The soil here had given up arrowheads and pottery for generations, but this time the iron blade rang against bone with a sound none of them would ever forget. One man dropped to his knees and brushed away the dark Ohio clay. What emerged was a femur, longer than any man's arm, thick as a fence post, still gleaming white after centuries underground. They kept digging. By dusk, the entire skeleton lay exposed on a canvas tarp beside the ditch. The men stood in a half circle, silent except for the wind moving through the corn. The skull was enormous, the eye sockets deep enough to swallow a fist, the ribs curved like barrel staves. When they stretched a surveyor's chain from heel bone to the top of the cranium, the tape read nearly 9 feet. 9 feet of solid, perfectly articulated bone. No sign of disease, no breakage. The jaw still carried a full set of teeth that looked, one witness later told the Chillicothe Gazette, strong enough to crack walnuts without trying. Word traveled faster than the evening train to Columbus. By lantern light, half the town had walked out to the field. People brought their own measuring tapes.
They brought Bibles. They brought whiskey.
A local photographer set up his glass plate camera and captured the only image anyone would ever see of the giant in place. 4 wide-eyed farmers standing shoulder to shoulder behind the outstretched skeleton, their boots muddy, their faces lit by kerosene lamps. That photograph would vanish too, but not before the Gazette described it in breathless detail the next morning. The Gazette's editor smelled the story of a lifetime. He killed the front page he had already set and ran a new headline in foot-high type. Giant skeleton unearthed in ancient mound, nearly 9 feet tall and perfectly preserved. The article quoted the farmers directly. "We've dug these mounds our whole lives. Never seen anything like this." This wasn't no ordinary Indian. This was something older. Something bigger. The paper hit the streets at dawn. By 8 o'clock, telegraph wires were humming. Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, every major daily picked it up within hours. Farmers from 3 counties started digging their own backyards, convinced the Ohio Valley was hiding an entire race of giants. But the real story, the one that turned a local curiosity into a national legend, began around 10 that same morning. A black carriage pulled by 4 matched bays rolled up the lane without warning. 2 men stepped down. Both wore dark suits cut in the Washington style. Both carried leather satchels stamped with the seal of the Smithsonian Institution. They introduced themselves only as field agents, authorized to secure artifacts of unusual scientific interest. They spoke quietly, politely, and with the kind of calm authority that makes ordinary men suddenly feel very small. One agent handed the lead farmer a thick envelope of cash, more money than he had seen in a year, and asked, still smiling, that the skeleton be crated immediately. The farmers hesitated. This was their find, their field, their story. But the agents had papers. They had a writ from the governor's office. And they had something else. An unmistakable sense that saying no would be a very bad idea. So the men went to work. The giant was packed into 3 custom-built pine crates padded with straw and sawdust. The skull went into its own reinforced box. By early afternoon, the crates were loaded onto the carriage. The agents nailed the lid shut with long copper nails, sealed every seam with wax imprinted by the Smithsonian's mark. Then came the warning. One agent pulled the lead farmer aside while the last crate was being lashed down. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder and spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "You've done your country a service today, but some things aren't meant for the public. You understand?" The farmer nodded, though he didn't. The second agent added, almost as an afterthought, "The Gazette has already been spoken to. There won't be a second edition on this matter." The carriage rolled away toward the train depot. By sunset, a special rail car, marked Smithsonian, Priority Scientific Cargo, had been coupled to the evening express bound for Washington. The giant was gone. The field was filled back in. The photograph plates were confiscated for study, and the Chillicothe Gazette printed a quiet retraction the following day. Further investigation has determined the bones were those of an unusually large but otherwise ordinary Indian chief. The matter is closed. Except the matter was not closed. Within 48 hours, letters started arriving at newspaper offices from Wisconsin, Tennessee, and Missouri. Each described the same thing: giant skeletons pulled from mounds, Smithsonian agents appearing within a day, crates vanishing on special trains. Some writers claimed the bones had double rows of teeth. Others swore the skulls still carried strands of coarse red hair. One man in West Virginia wrote that the giant he helped dig up had been buried with copper armor etched in symbols no one could read. Every letter carried the same refrain: the government came, the government took, and the government lied. And that was only the beginning. Because if the Smithsonian was willing to move that fast, willing to spend that much money, willing to threaten quiet farmers in the middle of Ohio farmland, then whatever those agents were hauling back to Washington had to be something far more dangerous than old bones. It had to be something that could rewrite history itself. Something the American people were never supposed to know existed. The rumors took root that night in the saloons and churchyards of southern Ohio. They would spread for the next 130 years. And every time another mound was opened and another tall skeleton reported, the same black carriage seemed to appear. The same polite men in dark suits, the same 24-hour disappearance. America had just met its first official giant cover-up. And the giants, it turned out, were only getting started. 2 days after the Ohio giant vanished onto that special rail car, the letters kept coming. Not just to the Chillicothe Gazette. They poured into newspaper offices from Pittsburgh to St. Louis, each one written in shaky farmhand script or careful schoolteacher penmanship. The postmarks told the story. Wisconsin, Tennessee, Missouri, even a few from the hills of West Virginia. Every envelope carried the same urgent warning: they're digging giants again, and the Smithsonian is already on the way. In Madison, Wisconsin, a crew widening a county road along the Rock River hit pay dirt in the same sweltering summer. The lead digger swore under oath to the local sheriff that the skeleton he uncovered measured over 10 feet from skull to heel. "I laid my own 6-foot frame beside it," he told the Wisconsin State Journal. "My head barely reached its kneecap." The bones were still wearing what looked like copper breastplates hammered thin as paper, etched with spirals and lightning bolts no one in town could translate. Before the Journal could send a sketch artist, 2 men in dark suits stepped off the afternoon train from Chicago. They paid the crew in gold coins, more than any of them would earn in 5 years, and crated the entire find while the rest of the men watched in stunned silence. The copper armor vanished. The skull with a strange double row of teeth vanished. The only thing left behind was a freshly filled hole and a warning not to speak of it, for the good of the Republic. Down in Middle Tennessee, the pattern repeated like clockwork. Near Franklin, in Williamson County, farmers plowing new tobacco fields struck bone in a low-rise locals had always called an old burial knob. One crew pulled up a complete skeleton, nearly 9 feet tall, still clutching a stone war club far too heavy for any normal man to swing. The skull still carried patches of coarse red hair. A local physician who examined the remains before the agents arrived told the Nashville Banner, "It looked like it died yesterday, not 1,000 years ago." The Banner printed the story in its evening edition. By sunrise the next day, the same black carriage rolled up. The agents introduced themselves as cultural preservation officers. They paid the landowners in crisp new $20 bills, loaded the giant and its artifacts into reinforced crates, and were rolling toward the depot before the dew had burned off the tobacco leaves. The Banner's follow-up the next morning was a single paragraph. Further examination reveals the remains to be those of a large but otherwise ordinary prehistoric Indian. The matter requires no further attention. Missouri joined the chorus within weeks. Near Moberly, railroad workers enlarging a cut for the Chicago and Alton line broke into a limestone cave sealed with hand-cut blocks. Inside lay several skeletons arranged in a circle, each one reported well over 9 feet tall. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch sent a reporter on the next train. He filed a dispatch describing jawbones that could bite through a plowshare and vertebrae the size of dinner plates. The story hit the wires at noon. By 6 o'clock that evening, 2 Smithsonian representatives were already at the site with a military escort. They sealed the cave entrance with fresh concrete, paid the railroad foreman a hazard bonus, and shipped the bones east under heavy canvas tarps. The Post-Dispatch never ran the follow-up. The reporter who wrote the original piece was quietly reassigned to the Society page. Back in Ohio, the firestorm was only growing. The Chillicothe Gazette, despite the warning, managed to sneak a second story into its classified section, disguised as a lost and found notice. It read simply, 9-foot gentleman missing since Tuesday. Last seen traveling with 2 well-dressed strangers from Washington. Reward if returned intact. Farmers began comparing notes at the general store. One man from Ross County produced a faded tintype of another giant he had helped dig years earlier, before the same agents had appeared and taken it away. Another swore he had seen the crates being unloaded at the Smithsonian's receiving dock in Washington, each one stenciled with the words, classified, anthropological anomaly, do not open. The rumors began to link the dots. These weren't random finds. This was systematic. Every mound from the Great Lakes to the Gulf seemed to hold the same secret, a race of red-haired giants who had ruled the continent long before the first native tribes arrived. The old Indian legends that had been dismissed as campfire tales suddenly sounded like history. The Delaware spoke of the tall ones who came from the west and waged war with thunder weapons. The Choctaw told of giants who built the mounds as fortresses and were finally driven into the caves by a great flood. The Paiute of Nevada still whispered about the red-haired cannibals of Lovelock Cave who stood twice the height of a man. Suddenly, those stories weren't myth anymore. They were survivor testimony. And the Smithsonian? They were the janitors of American history, rushing from state to state with cash, crates, and polite threats, erasing every piece of evidence before the public could ask the obvious question. If these giants were real, why had no one ever told us? Why did every textbook still claim the first Americans crossed a land bridge 12,000 years ago, small-statured hunter-gatherers with stone spears? Why did the government move with the speed of a bank robber covering his tracks? By the end of that summer, the whispers had hardened into something darker. Letters arrived at the offices of Scientific American and Popular Science, written by doctors and professors who had examined the bones before the agents arrived. One Chicago anatomist described a femur whose medullary cavity was the size of a shotgun barrel, impossible for ordinary human bone to support without shattering under its own weight. Yet these bones showed no stress fractures. Another witness from Kentucky claimed the giants had been buried with mica mirrors and copper coils that looked like primitive electrical components. A third swore the teeth were not just double-rowed, but filed to points, like those of predators. The newspapers printed every detail they could before the agents showed up. Headlines screamed, "Another Titan unearthed! Government silence deafening. Red-haired giants of the mounds! Smithsonian takes possession. Is America hiding its prehistoric masters?" For a few electric weeks in the summer of 1890, it felt like the lid was about to blow off the greatest archaeological secret in the history of the Republic. Then, just as quickly as it had ignited, the public conversation began to cool. Editors received quiet visits. Reporters were reassigned. Farmers who had spoken too freely found their bank loans suddenly called due. The black carriages kept rolling across the heartland, always arriving within 24 hours, always leaving with the evidence and leaving behind the same message. This never happened. But the letters kept coming. The eyewitnesses refused to stay silent forever. And somewhere in the basement vaults of the Smithsonian Institution, crates labeled only with dates and locations were stacking up like cordwood. America wasn't just digging up bones anymore. It was digging up a truth that someone very powerful, was willing to bury at any cost. The summer of 1890 did not end with a handful of isolated finds. It exploded into a pattern so consistent, so relentless that even the most skeptical newspaper editors in the East began to wonder if something far larger than bones was being hidden beneath the American soil. The reports kept arriving, each one more impossible than the last, yet each one following the exact same script. A farmer or a road crew would strike bone in an ancient mound. The skeleton would measure between 8 and 12 feet. The skull would show those same eerie features: heavy brow ridges, a jaw built like a bear trap, and often a second row of teeth gleaming behind the first. Strands of coarse red hair would still cling to the cranium, preserved by the alkaline clay of the Midwest. And within 24 hours, never 48, the black carriage would appear. 2 men in dark suits, cash on the barrelhead, crates nailed shut. A polite but unmistakable warning. Then silence. By August, the whispers had a name: the red-haired giants. Farmers in Iowa wrote to their congressman describing warriors buried with copper shields so finely hammered they rang like bells when struck. A schoolteacher in Illinois claimed she had held a stone tablet pulled from the same grave, covered in symbols that looked like a cross between Egyptian hieroglyphs and the petroglyphs of the Anasazi, symbols no living tribe claimed as their own. In Kentucky, a coal miner swore the giant he helped excavate still clutched a spear point forged from meteoric iron, its edges sharper than any steel blade the local blacksmith could make. Every artifact screamed the same message. These were not primitive hunter-gatherers. These were a people who knew metalworking, who understood astronomy, who built earthworks that rivaled the pyramids in precision. And someone in Washington was making sure the rest of the country never found out. The conspiracy theorists of 1890 did not need the internet to connect the dots. They had telegraph wires and a shared sense that the official story of America's past was cracking wide open. They pointed to the Bible. Genesis 6:4 spoke of the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Men of renown who walk the earth in the days before the flood. The giants of old. The same red-haired giants the Paiute Indians still feared in their oral histories. Cannibals driven into Lovelock Cave and sealed inside by the first tribes. The same tall ones the Iroquois legends described as building the mounds before being wiped out in a great war. The Delaware spoke of the tall ones who came from the west and waged war with thunder weapons. The Choctaw told of giants who built the mounds as fortresses and were finally driven into the caves by a great flood. Suddenly, every native creation story sounded like eyewitness testimony. The giants had been here first. They had ruled. They had fallen. And now the United States government was treating their bones like classified military technology. Why? The answer seemed obvious to those who followed the story. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had been published only 31 years earlier. The scientific establishment was still fighting to make evolution the law of the land. If these 9-foot skeletons with advanced artifacts proved that an entire race of sophisticated beings had lived in North America thousands of years before the accepted timeline, the entire house of cards would collapse. Textbooks would have to be rewritten. Churches would have to admit the flood story might be literal. And worst of all, the young republic's carefully crafted narrative that the continent had been a wilderness inhabited only by primitive tribes would be exposed as a lie. Manifest Destiny itself rested on the idea that the land was empty and waiting. What if it had been conquered once before? By giants. The pattern of the disappearances became its own proof. Always 24 hours, always the Smithsonian. Always the same 2 men, or men who looked and spoke exactly like them. They carried the same leather satchels, they used the same phrase every time, for the good of the Republic. They paid in new bills or gold coins that bore no marks of circulation. And every single time, the local paper would print a retraction within 48 hours, blaming overzealous reporting or mistaken measurements by untrained eyes. Some witnesses refused to stay quiet. A doctor in Cincinnati who had examined one of the skulls before the agents arrived published a private pamphlet in 1891. He described the cranial capacity as 20% larger than modern man, room for a brain that could have invented the wheel, the lever, perhaps even electricity. He included detailed measurements and a sketch of the double dental arcade. The pamphlet sold out in a week. Then, every copy mysteriously vanished from bookstores. The doctor himself was found dead 2 months later, ruled a suicide by the same authorities who had once praised his scientific rigor. Meanwhile, rumors leaked from inside the Smithsonian itself.
Janitors whispered of a sub-basement beneath the National Museum, where crates stamped anomalous skeletons, restricted access, were stacked floor to ceiling.
Night watchmen claimed they heard muffled voices behind the steel doors, voices speaking in a language that was not English, not Latin, not anything taught at Harvard. One retired curator, on his deathbed in 1903, allegedly told his nurse that he had seen the bones himself. They weren't human. Not like us. They were built for a different world. The conspiracy had now reached critical mass. Farmers formed secret societies to dig at night. Amateur archaeologists began hiding their finds in root cellars instead of reporting them. Letters flooded the offices of every major paper, demanding a congressional investigation. If the Smithsonian is burying giants, one editor wrote in a rare editorial that survived the censors, then who exactly are they protecting? And what are they protecting us from? The government never answered. Instead, the black carriages kept rolling, the crates kept disappearing. And the red-haired giants, those impossible, magnificent relics of a forbidden chapter in human history, were quietly erased from the record, one mound at a time. But the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. Because if the giants were real, if the Smithsonian was willing to break every rule of science and decency to hide them, then the question every American should have been asking in the summer of 1890 was no longer, did they exist? The question had become far more dangerous. What else is the government still hiding in those locked vaults beneath Washington? And how many more giants are sleeping under the fields we walk across every single day, waiting for the next pickaxe to strike bone? The summer of 1890 bled into fall, and the red-haired giants refused to stay silent. What had begun as a single, shocking discovery in an Ohio cornfield had become a continental fever dream. Farmers, miners, and railroad crews from the Great Lakes to the Ozarks were now digging with a single obsession: find the next one before the men in the black carriage could arrive. Newspapers that had once printed cautious retractions now ran full-page illustrated spreads under banner headlines that screamed the impossible. The Chicago Tribune carried a woodcut of a 12-foot skeleton towering over a line of Union soldiers, captioned, "The Ancient Masters of America. Why is Washington hiding them?" Harper's Weekly published a map dotted with red pins, each pin a reported giant find since July. By October, the map showed more than 40 locations, stretching from Minnesota's Iron Ranges to the limestone bluffs of Arkansas. The public was no longer merely curious, it was electrified. In the small town of Delphi, Indiana, a group of Civil War veterans formed the Mound Guard Society. They patrolled known burial sites at night with lanterns and shotguns, determined to protect the next giant from the Smithsonian's reach. When two agents did appear one frosty morning in November, the veterans met them at the edge of the field with rifles leveled. The agents smiled their polite Washington smiles, produced a larger envelope of cash, and left empty-handed for the first time. The veterans' victory lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th, federal marshals arrived with a court order. The giant, 11 feet tall, red hair still braided with copper beads, was seized under the newly invoked Antiquities Protection Act. The veterans were told their actions bordered on treason. Panic rippled outward. Mothers in rural Kansas kept their children home from school, whispering that the giants had once been cannibals and might not be entirely dead. Preachers in Missouri revival tents thundered from the pulpit that the Nephilim had returned, that the end times were written in bone. In New York salons, society ladies held seances, trying to contact the spirit of a giant king whose name, they claimed, was Chillicothe, the builder of mounds. Spiritualists published pamphlets with detailed drawings of the double-toothed skulls and claimed the beings had possessed psychic powers strong, enough to move stones weighing tons. And still the crates kept disappearing. A retired Smithsonian janitor named Elias Crow surfaced in a Philadelphia boarding house in early 1891. He had worked the night shift for 17 years. In a sworn affidavit published by a small independent press, Crow described what he called the vault. It lay 3 stories beneath the National Museum of Natural History, accessed only by a freight elevator guarded by armed Marines in civilian clothes. Inside the vault, he said, the air was kept artificially cold and dry. Row after row of pine crates stretched into the darkness, each stenciled with a state name and a date. Ohio, 1890. Wisconsin, 1890. Tennessee, 1890. Missouri, 1890. The crates were stacked 20 feet high. Some were marked fragile, dental anomalies. Others read, heavy metal artifacts, do not X-ray. Crow claimed he had once been ordered to help move a crate that split open. Inside lay a skull the size of a washtub, its eye sockets still holding what looked like polished quartz lenses. The teeth, 2 perfect rows, glinted under the gaslight. He was told never to speak of it. 2 weeks later, he was dismissed without pension. The affidavit ended with a single chilling line. They are not storing history down there. They are burying a second America, one that existed before the Indians, one that the government will never let us see. The affidavit sold out in hours. Copies were passed hand to hand in barber shops and grange halls. People began to speak openly of the second race, a pre-Indian civilization of red-haired giants who had engineered the Mississippi River mounds as astronomical observatories, who had smelted copper on an industrial scale, who had ruled the continent for thousands of years until some catastrophe, flood, plague, or war had wiped them out. The native tribes, the theory went, had simply moved into the ruins and adopted the giant stories as their own legends. The Smithsonian knew it all. They had known since the 1870s, and every time a new skeleton surfaced, they raced to bury the evidence before Darwin's fragile timeline could be shattered and before the American people realized their entire national story was built on a lie. Congress received petitions with more than 80,000 signatures demanding the vault be opened to the public. A freshman senator from Ohio stood on the floor and demanded an investigation, waving a copy of the Chillicothe Gazette's original giant story. The Speaker of the House ruled the motion out of order. The next day, every major newspaper ran identical editorials calling the entire affair a classic case of mass hysteria fueled by yellow journalism. The black carriages kept rolling. The crates kept vanishing. By the spring of 1891, the country had reached a fever pitch. Farmers refused to sell land containing mounds. Railroad companies quietly rerouted tracks to avoid known burial grounds. Children traded giant cards the way they once traded baseball cards, each card showing a different reported skeleton with its height and the date it disappeared. The lore had become gospel. America was no longer debating whether giants had once walked the land. It was debating what else the Smithsonian was hiding and how deep the cover-up truly went. Because if an entire race of advanced beings had been erased from history once, what was to stop the government from doing it again? And what exactly would they be willing to do if the next pickaxe struck something even bigger than bone? But even as the petitions piled up on congressional desks and the vault rumors spread like wildfire through the heartland, something quieter began to happen in the smoke-filled newsrooms of the East. A handful of editors, men who had cut their teeth on the raw edges of Gilded Age journalism, started doing what reporters are supposed to do. They went back to the original clippings. They reread the breathless dispatches from Ohio, Wisconsin, Tennessee, and for the first time since that pickaxe rang against bone in Chillicothe, they began to see the story not as gospel, but as ink on cheap newsprint. The pivot came slowly, almost reluctantly, because no one wanted to kill the most exciting archaeological tale America had ever told. Yet the cracks were there if you looked. Take the language itself. Almost every giant report carried the same careful qualifiers that yellow press editors love to bury in the second paragraph. It is reported. Witnesses claim, according to local farmers, the Chillicothe Gazette's original headline had screamed nearly 9 feet, but the body of the article admitted the measurement was taken with a surveyor's chain that had been lying in the mud for weeks. No calipers. No anatomist present.
Just four excited men stretching a rusty chain along wet bone and calling it science.
The Wisconsin State Journal described the 10-foot skeleton as precisely measured, yet the same article noted the femur crumbled to dust the moment it was exposed to air. How do you measure something that turns to powder before the tape is even rolled out?
The agents fared no better under scrutiny.
The two men in dark suits appeared in dozens of letters and second-hand accounts, yet no one could produce a single photograph, a single signed receipt, or even a consistent physical description beyond tall one with glasses, shorter one with a scar. No one at the Smithsonian in Washington would confirm their employment. The institution's own annual report for 1890, printed in plain black and white for anyone with access to a public library, listed field agents by name and assignment. The mysterious pair was nowhere on the roster. The special rail car that supposedly whisked the Ohio giant to Washington? Railroad manifests from that week showed no priority cargo from Chillicothe to the capital. Just the usual freight of hogs, timber, and grain. Even the red hair started to look less biblical and more practical. Several witnesses had described coarse red strands still clinging to the skull. But 1890s newspapers had a habit of mentioning that detail only after the first stories from Ohio. Later accounts copied it verbatim, like a game of telephone played across state lines. Soil chemists would later point out that the alkaline clay of the Ohio Valley often turned bone a reddish hue and preserved organic material with an iron oxide stain that could easily be mistaken for hair, especially by men who wanted to see giants. And then there was the larger historical context that no one had bothered to mention while the black carriages were rolling. For nearly 50 years before 1890, American archaeologists had been locked in a bitter debate known as the Mound Builder controversy. Who built the thousands of earthen pyramids and serpent effigies scattered across the Midwest? The popular romantic theory held that they were the work of a lost white race, perhaps Welsh, perhaps Atlantean, perhaps even the 10 lost tribes of Israel, wiped out by the savage Indians who arrived later. It was a convenient story for a young nation hungry to claim a glorious pre-Columbian past. Newspapers sold copies by the tens of thousands, feeding that hunger. When a tall skeleton turned up, it fit the narrative too perfectly. Editors didn't need a conspiracy in Washington. They needed circulation. And nothing sold like a 9-foot white giant who proved America's soil had once belonged to a superior race. The Smithsonian itself had been collecting mound artifacts since the 1870s under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, a careful ethnologist who was in the middle of a multi-year survey. Thomas's final report, published in 1894, would conclude that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the very native tribes living nearby. Nothing more, nothing less. But in 1890, that conclusion was still 3 years away. In the meantime, every tall bone that surfaced became ammunition in the culture war. A few skeptical voices began to speak up in print. The American Antiquarian magazine ran a short note in its January 1891 issue, pointing out that many of these so-called giant remains have been measured by persons unaccustomed to osteological work, using improvised tools under conditions of great excitement. Popular Science, never one to chase ghosts, published a letter from a New York physician who had examined one of the few bones that actually reached a laboratory before disappearing. He measured the femur at a respectable but entirely human 23 inches. Tall for an Indian warrior, certainly, but nowhere near the thigh bone longer than a man's arm described in the papers. The extra length, he suggested, came from the reporter adding the foot and ankle bones to the measurement for dramatic effect. The deathbed affidavit of the janitor Elias Crow? Charming story. But when cross-checked, the boarding house address he gave did not exist in Philadelphia city directories. The independent press that printed it had a circulation of fewer than 200 copies and a reputation for printing anything that paid the rent. None of this proved the giants were fake. Not yet. The bones had still been real enough to send farmers reaching for shovels and congressmen reaching for petitions. But the perfect clockwork timing of the cover-up, the identical descriptions of the agents, the way every story seemed to borrow details from the one before it, those elements were starting to feel less like a government conspiracy and more like something far older and far simpler. Something that had been happening in American newsrooms since the first penny papers hit the streets. The summer of 1890 had been built on wonder. Now the autumn was asking a colder question. What if the real cover-up wasn't in the Smithsonian's basement at all?
What if it was right there on the front pages, sold for 2 cents a copy to a public that desperately wanted to believe?
The pivot that began in those smoke-filled newsrooms did not kill the giant story overnight. It simply started weighing it down with the one thing yellow journalism fears most: cold, unforgiving numbers. Start with the skeleton itself. Every human bone obeys the same laws of physics that govern every bridge, every skyscraper, and every living thing that walks the earth. Scale a man up to 9 feet tall while keeping the same proportions, and his weight doesn't double or triple, it cubes. A normal 6-foot man weighs around 180 pounds. Stretch him to 9 feet, and simple mathematics says he now weighs roughly 600 pounds. But his leg bones, if they stayed the same thickness, would still have only the cross-section of a normal femur. That is not enough surface area to support the load. The bones would snap the instant he tried to stand. To carry that kind of mass, the skeleton would need femurs as thick as a man's thigh, and vertebrae the diameter of dinner plates, not the barrel-stave ribs described in the papers. No such reinforced giants have ever been found in any mound, any cave, or any laboratory. Not in 1890. Not in the century that followed. The Smithsonian's own osteologists, the very men accused of hiding the evidence, measured thousands of Mound Builder remains between 1879 and 1894. The tallest complete adult male skeleton in their catalog topped out at 6 feet 6 inches. Tall for the era, but still firmly human. The rest fell between 5'4" and 6'1", exactly what you would expect from well-fed native populations living on river-bottom farmland. The double row of teeth that appeared in so many breathless accounts fares no better under scrutiny. Hyperdontia, the medical term for extra teeth, does exist. It occurs in roughly 1 in every 2,000 births, almost always as a single supernumerary tooth, never as a complete second arcade across an entire population. A race of giants all sporting perfect double dentition would be biologically impossible without a genetic mutation so catastrophic it would have wiped the group out in a single generation. More often, what witnesses actually saw were normal teeth plus retained deciduous fragments, or, in some cases, the roots of broken teeth that had been misread in the excitement of lantern light. Even the red hair dissolves under basic taphonomy, the study of how bodies decay after death. Ancient bone in alkaline Midwest soil frequently picks up iron oxides from the surrounding clay. That oxide stains organic material a rusty red. Burial practices added another layer. Many tribes used red ochre paint in funeral rites, a pigment still visible on thousands of normal-sized skeletons excavated under controlled conditions. The coarse red strands were almost certainly ochre residue or degraded collagen fibers stained by centuries of groundwater. Under a microscope, they never matched modern human hair follicles. They were simply dirt and mineral, doing what dirt and minerals have done for millennia. Then there is the embarrassing case of the misidentified megafauna. In the late 19th century, farmers digging in the same glacial till that once held woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths had no training in comparative anatomy. A mastodon femur looks remarkably like an oversized human thigh bone when you are holding it in a muddy ditch at dusk. The same goes for the massive humerus of a megalonyx ground sloth. Several of the giant finds reported in Missouri and Wisconsin were later examined by trained paleontologists and quietly reclassified as extinct animal remains. The newspapers never printed corrections. Why would they? The giant story sold papers. The sloth story did not. Measurements themselves were comedy. In an age before standardized calipers or x-rays, excited farmers used whatever was handy. Surveyors' chains, wagon spokes, even pieces of twine. Bones fresh from the earth are wet and flexible. They sag and stretch under their own weight the moment the supporting soil is removed. Add the tendency of reporters to round up for dramatic effect. Nearly 9 feet sounds far more biblical than 8 feet 7.5, and the numbers inflate like carnival balloons.
When the few intact long bones that survived transport were finally measured in Washington, they consistently fell within the normal range for large-statured native males. The rest had crumbled to dust, exactly as any untrained digger should have expected. None of this required a conspiracy. It required only the ordinary failings of 1890 America. Poor lighting, no cameras at every dig, newspapers paid by the inch, and a public hungry for proof that their continent had a more glorious past than the textbooks allowed. The Smithsonian was not racing across the country to bury giants. It was doing exactly what it had been chartered to do, cataloging the past, while local editors raced to print the next sensation before the competition could. The black carriages? Almost certainly, real men from the Bureau of Ethnology or the National Museum, traveling on government per diem to secure artifacts before pot hunters could loot them for private sale. Cash changed hands because that was how the government legally acquired specimens in an era before federal land claims. The warnings were standard polite requests not to disturb burial sites protected by emerging antiquities law. The math does not lie. The biology does not bend. And the bones, when they actually reached a laboratory, never measured up to the legend. Yet even as the scientific house of cards began to collapse, one last pillar remained: the paper trail, the manifests. The official records that should have shown thousands of giant crates arriving in Washington if even a fraction of the stories were true. That trail, it turned out, was the emptiest of all. The paper trail, when anyone finally bothered to follow it, turned out to be the most damning evidence of all. Because conspiracies this vast leave trails, shipping manifests, acquisition ledgers, budget entries, even the mundane carbon copies of expense reports that every government clerk has filed since the invention of carbon paper. The Smithsonian Institution, for all the dark rumors swirling around its basement vaults, was, and still is, a meticulous bureaucracy. Every artifact that crossed its threshold since 1846 had to be logged, cataloged, measured, photographed, and stored according to strict protocols. If thousands of 9-foot skeletons had really arrived in special rail cars between 1890 and 1894, the records would be impossible to hide. They are not hidden. They simply do not exist. The Smithsonian's annual reports for those years, public documents still available on the shelves of any major research library, list exactly what was collected from the mounds: pottery shards, copper beads, stone pipes, shell gorgets, and thousands of normal human skeletons. The tallest complete adult male skeleton ever officially accessioned from a mound site during that entire period measured 6 feet 6 inches. Not 9 feet, not 10, 6 feet 6 inches. The rest averaged 5'8", tall for the era, but no taller than many documented native warriors whose descendants still live in the same river valleys. Every femur, every cranium, every rib was entered into the catalog with its precise measurements in millimeters. There are no entries marked anomalous height, restricted. No crates labeled Nephilim, do not open. No line items for the cost of special rail cars or the salaries of any mysterious field agents. The field notes of Cyrus Thomas, the man actually in charge of the mound survey, survive in their original handwritten form. Thomas was no government shill. He was a former Confederate soldier turned self-taught ethnologist who spent years living among the tribes whose ancestors had built the mounds. His 1894 report to Congress, 742 pages of dense data, concludes without drama that the mounds were the work of the ancestors of the very native tribes living nearby. Nothing more, nothing less. He examined dozens of skeletons himself. He measured them with calibrated steel tapes under good light. He noted pathologies, dental wear, arthritis, everything a real scientist would record. Nowhere does he mention giants, double rows of teeth, or red-haired cannibals. The only cover-up Thomas ever participated in was the quiet academic effort to replace romantic myth with boring, verifiable fact. Even the supposed 24-hour disappearances collapse when you look at the railroads. The Chicago and Alton, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Pennsylvania lines, all kept meticulous freight logs for liability reasons. A special sealed car marked Smithsonian Priority Scientific Cargo would have required special billing, special routing, and special insurance. None exist for the summer and fall of 1890. Not one. The only documented shipments from Chillicothe, Madison, or Franklin during those months were the usual agricultural freight and the occasional crate of pottery and normal bones sent by local collectors who actually followed the rules. What about the bones themselves? The few that were not reburied on site or crumbled to dust in amateur hands were accessioned into the collection and remain there today. Modern researchers, using CT scanners, DNA analysis, and isotope testing unavailable in 1890, have examined hundreds of them.
The results are consistent. Standard Homo sapiens, Native American genetic markers, diets based on maize and river fish, lifespans and heights exactly matching the archaeological record for the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures. No anomalous DNA. No signs of unknown hominin species. No evidence of any population that could support the biomechanical load of a 9-foot frame. The red hair turns out to be exactly what the chemist said it was: iron oxide staining and ochre pigment. The copper armor is trade copper hammered thin by known native metalworkers. The strange symbols are the same geometric motifs found on thousands of ordinary gorgets and pipes. The real fate of the bones was never a vault in Washington. Most of them were simply left in the ground where they belonged, protected by emerging federal antiquities law. The Smithsonian did collect some, legally, openly, and with the permission of landowners, but only the normal ones. The rest stayed buried because that was the ethical and scientific thing to do. The agents who showed up in black carriages were, in almost every verifiable case, real representatives of the Bureau of Ethnology or the National Museum, doing exactly what the law required, securing artifacts before pot hunters sold them to private collectors in Europe. The cash they carried was standard government per diem for acquiring specimens. The polite warnings were simply requests not to disturb protected burial sites. No threats, no secrecy. Just bureaucracy moving at 1890 speed. The deathbed janitor, the missing doctor, the secret pamphlets. Every one of those stories traces back to the same small circle of sensationalist publishers who specialized in suppressed knowledge. Their printing presses ran on the same fuel that powered the giant headlines: public fascination and 2-cent sales. When the stories stopped selling, the affidavits stopped appearing. The vault was never more than a rumor, told in boarding houses by men who needed a good tale to pay the rent. By 1895, the entire episode had quietly faded from the front pages. The Mound Builder controversy was over. Science had won. The giants had never existed outside the imaginations of farmers with rusty measuring chains and editors who knew a circulation booster when they saw one. And yet, the crates in the rumor never stopped arriving. The black carriages never stopped rolling. The government, according to the story that refused to die, was still hiding something. Because the paper trail may have been empty, but the human need to believe in a hidden chapter of history was not. That need would keep the legend alive long after the last 1890 newspaper had yellowed and crumbled. It would wait in the shadows of the internet age, ready to be reborn the moment someone typed Smithsonian giant cover-up into a search bar. And that is where the final truth of 1890 finally comes into focus. The year is 2026, and the red-haired giants of 1890 have never really left us. Scroll through any corner of the internet labeled Forbidden History, and the same photographs appear. Grainy tintypes of tall skeletons, the same newspaper clippings yellowed by time, the same urgent captions demanding to know why the Smithsonian still refuses to open its vaults. The story has been polished by a century of retelling. 9-foot warriors, double rows of teeth, black carriages racing across the Midwest, a government so terrified of the truth that it buried an entire race under layers of official silence. The details have grown sharper with every decade. The giants are no longer merely tall. They are now proof of Atlantis, of ancient aliens, of a pre-flood civilization erased by the same powers that control the history books today.
Yet the paper trail remains exactly as empty as it was in 1895. The bones that were measured under laboratory lights have never exceeded 6 feet 6 inches. The DNA says Native American. The physics says impossible. The shipping records say nothing ever arrived. The conspiracy, when stripped of its romance, rests on nothing more substantial than the same human weaknesses that sold newspapers in the Gilded Age and sell clicks in the algorithm age. The hunger for a secret, the comfort of believing that someone, somewhere, is hiding the most important truth in the world. Why did the myth explode in the summer of 1890? Because America needed it. The country was hurtling through the Industrial Revolution, tearing up ancient landscapes for railroads and drainage ditches, replacing old certainties with Darwin and steel mills. The Mound Builder controversy had already primed the public to believe in a lost white civilization that made the Indians look like latecomers. When tall bones turned up, measured with string and hope by men who had never seen a real femur in their lives, the press did what the press has always done. It gave the people the story they were willing to pay for. A story that flattered them. A story that said their land had once belonged to giants, not to the tribes they had just finished displacing. A story that turned ordinary farmers into witnesses to biblical prophecy. The Smithsonian became the perfect villain because every institution that collects the past eventually looks like it is hoarding secrets. Real grievances existed. Thousands of native remains were taken without consent, stored without ceremony, studied without permission. Those wrongs were genuine. NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, was written precisely to address that painful history. But the giants were the embellishment that made the grievance mythic. They turned a legitimate fight over repatriation into an epic tale of Nephilim and cover-ups. The black carriages were real men doing real bureaucratic work. The public turned them into agents of a satanic cabal because that version felt bigger than the truth. Crowd psychology did the rest. Once the first headline screamed giant, every subsequent dig became a confirmation. Farmers who found normal skeletons suddenly remembered them as taller. Reporters who needed copy borrowed details from the last story. The 24-hour window was never policy. It was the time it took for a telegram to reach Washington and a field agent to buy a train ticket. But in the retelling, it became proof of panic at the highest levels. The red hair was iron oxide. The double teeth were wishful thinking. The vault was a rumor told by a man who needed rent money. None of it mattered. The story had already escaped the facts. And that is the final, uncomfortable truth the 1890 giants teach us. Conspiracy theories are not born from evidence. They are born from the ache of living in a world that feels too small, too ordinary, too well explained. We want the mounds to hide something more magnificent than maize farmers and copper traders. We want the Smithsonian to be guarding forbidden knowledge because it is easier than admitting that the past is mostly ordinary people doing ordinary things, building, loving, dying, and leaving their bones behind without fanfare. The giants let us believe we are the heirs to a lost golden age, instead of the latest chapter in a long, messy human story. The real cover-up, if there ever was one, was never about 9-foot skeletons. It was about the quiet, relentless work of science, slowly replacing legend with data. Every time a new bone is dated, every time a DNA sample is sequenced, every time a mound is mapped with ground-penetrating radar, the giants shrink a little more. Not because anyone is hiding them, but because reality is stubbornly refusing to cooperate with the legend. Yet even now, somewhere in a quiet field in southern Ohio, a farmer will turn up a long bone after a hard rain. He will stretch a tape across it. He will feel his pulse quicken. And for one electric moment, before the rational part of his mind catches up, he will wonder. That moment, that tiny, irresistible pause before the debunking begins, is why the red-haired giants will never truly die. They are not buried in the Smithsonian. They are buried in the part of us that still needs to believe the world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than the textbooks allow. And perhaps, in the end, that is the only giant that was ever real.